Université de Montréal and from CAS for inviting me to this, to speak tonight. I was lucky that I was able to attend much of the discussions today because I actually see some parallels, I think, between modern times and digital regulation and the establishment of AIIB. Multilateral development banks have been around since the World Bank was created in the 1940s, and some of what went on in putting together AIIB was modern times and multilateral development banks. So there is another theme that I will mention later, and that is that embedded in the purposes and preamble of the AIIB is a focus on connectivity. And while it talks about infrastructure connectivity, I don't think there's any sense in which it was meant to be limited to physical infrastructure. And so I think in the years ahead, AIIB will also have to face, in projects it finances in countries around the world, some of these questions of digital connectivity, cross-border issues. And so even if that's not on the plate today, I think there definitely are connections. But first, let me start with what is AIIB. There's absolutely no reason you should know what it is, but I will try to tell you. So it is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I will call it AIIB. There are those who call it AIIB. I just can't make that fall off my tongue, so I've stuck to AIIB. It is an international organization. It is a multilateral development bank, which means that there are many different countries that are shareholders and members. It opened in January 2016. Its capital is $100 billion. And its purpose is to support infrastructure and other sectors to enhance Asian regional productivity, among other things. And why is it noteworthy? Because China was the leading player and the proponent of AIIB and remains the largest shareholder. This is probably the first time when China has taken such a big role in setting up an international organization. And so for that purpose alone, it attracted a lot of attention. And as I tell you a little bit of the story of how it was set up, you'll see some of the other reasons. But I also want to tell you why I wrote this book and what my role was. There's the book. And if you are interested, there's some brochures with a discount because Oxford doesn't publish its books cheaply. I have been a lawyer at the World Bank, as Clementine mentions, for about 30 years. And I probably spent the first 20 or so on World Bank lending operations in many different countries, but a lot in China. I had worked on Chinese legal reform, which is one reason I ended up teaching about it later. And many of my friends assumed that I was approached to help set up AIIB because I knew something about China. But actually, there are a lot of people who know something about China. Many of them live there. But there are also plenty of foreign legal experts who know something about China. The last 10 years I was in the World Bank, I was the chief lawyer for governance, for institutional questions, for what can the board do, what can the president do. And at the end of that, there was a push for many years to reform the governance of the World Bank Group, to make it more open to the voice of developing countries, and to reflect better the, if you want, the geopolitical structure of the 2000s rather than the 1940s. So the last thing I worked on at the World Bank was reforming the World Bank Group governance, and we ended up shifting the shares around and changing a bit the articles and the size of the board to give more weight to the voice of developing countries. But as a result of that, China also became the third largest shareholder in the World Bank, and I thought that was a pretty good time to retire, which I did. Then I was asked about 4 years later if I would help set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Initially, I confused this with what you might have heard of as the BRICS Bank. The BRICS Bank is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They had gotten together and established something that's legally called the New Development Bank, NDB. Almost no one calls it that, they all call it the BRICS Bank. And I'd kind of heard about the BRICS Bank when I was working on voice reform at the World Bank, and I heard it was going to be in Shanghai. And I've spent a lot of time traveling to Beijing, but I hadn't spent much time traveling to Shanghai. So I said, sure. And then I found out there was this other bank. So I'd already said yes, so it seemed like a good reason to continue to help. But I want to emphasize that in putting together the AIB charter, which was my first job, and in writing this book, I looked at what all the other development banks had done. So I looked at the World Bank Charter from 1944 and the Inter-American Bank Charter from 1957 and the ADB Charter for the Asian Development Bank from the 60s and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development from 1990 and a whole bunch of others. But as you all know, if you just look at the documents, that doesn't tell you the story. So I called up and Skyped with lawyers from all around the world who had worked at these institutions and said, modern times, what would you change and what would you keep? Because you can't really tell from the outside whether some innocuous statement in the legal framework that you think could really be better written turns out to have been a cornerstone of legal opinions from some brilliant general counsel somewhere. And I wanted to know that before I messed around with other people's proposals. So that'll give you some idea of the perspective I'm speaking from, and that's a lot of what's covered in the book, which is AIB has this, here's what the others have. So the idea of an Asian infrastructure investment bank, as it turns out, has been around for a long time. I think when you start to scratch many of these international proposals, you see that they've had a history of being thought about in different countries and not taking root, and then eventually the time is right. So this was a general idea floated after the 1999 Asian financial crisis. I think initially within China, then within ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and in some UN fora. But it really gained momentum 10 or 12 years later when Xi Jinping announced that China wanted to help establish an Asian infrastructure investment bank, which was in October of 2013. There's a lot written, and some of you may have seen an article that was circulated about the history or some views on why AIB was established. I have to confess I didn't ask. I just thought it was a really interesting proposal, and I knew a lot from my in-house work at the World Bank, and I could help make it better. But I've since heard lots of theories. And one is infrastructure. Not just the story that these multilateral development banks, which had been focused on financing infrastructure projects in developing countries as part of their work for many years, had many of them stepped back from that. And there was a demand for more infrastructure. So I think that's part of it. It's also said that infrastructure was really important for China's development, and that I think part of the motivation of China's leaders in proposing this was that they felt the route to economic development had been through infrastructure, and they wanted to promote that in other countries. There are many who say the reason for AIB was reforming the international financial institutions, by which they usually mean Washington, which is the World Bank, and the IMF. And they really mean the IMF, even though they don't say that, because I think the Chinese were, as far as I know, pretty happy with the reforms we put together in 2010 at the World Bank. But the parallel reforms at the IMF were stalled for about 5 years because of US couldn't get congressional approval. So those are all factors. Clearly, this was part of China's outward strategy. It was announced at about the same time as the One Belt, One Road initiative that someone mentioned in the previous session that now goes by the brand name of the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. So clearly at the same time, and I'm sure there are other reasons. And let me tell you a little bit about the formation process, because I think it'll give you a sense of why I don't think of this as a Chinese bank, although many people confuse it as such. So after Xi Jinping announced this in October 2013, China opened up consultations with other countries. I wasn't involved, so I don't know any of the details, but I've read about it. They had 5 rounds of multilateral consultation meetings, and just about 1 year after it was announced, in October of 2014, there were 22 countries that signed a memorandum of understanding on setting up AIB. And they left it open for others to join if they accepted the same terms. So one of the questions, I was brought in just about right after that was signed, was we're going to be negotiating an international treaty. There was a fairly tight deadline for that, which you won't find surprising, knowing how things go in international world, but this one actually happened. So the idea was that the charter would be signed by the end of June, which was about 7 months later, and AIB would be open for business by the end of 2015. We missed by about 2 weeks. But one of the interesting legal questions was, if you want to sign a treaty at the end of June at the latest, when do you stop negotiating? And since I neglected to take a really good course on treaty law when I was in law school in the 70s, not knowing that this would be relevant, I said, well, most countries have some kind of domestic process before they can sign a treaty, whether it's governmental approvals or parliamentary approvals. You must need 4 weeks. Let's finish negotiations in May. Then the next question is, well, we said other countries can come in if they agree to the terms of the MOU. How late can they come in? In principle, they could come in on May 22nd, which happened to be the day when we finished negotiations. But there are 2 problems with that. One is, one of the most interesting parts of all of these charters is Schedule A. I know it's hard to think of a schedule as being interesting, but it's the money. Because these are basically structured as companies where you buy shares. Each member subscribes to a number of shares, mostly based on their economic weight, which is why China is the largest shareholder, in this case it's GDP. So Schedule A, you can't walk in with everybody having their numbers and figure it out in 2 days. So you need some amount of time to figure out who wants to put in what for Schedule A. The other thing is, I don't think it happens too often that one group has negotiated everything in a document and other people walk in and say, I love absolutely every word of it, and there's nothing I want to change. So it seemed practical to leave a period so that you could at least have everybody who was going to be part of this come in a month before. So we said, fine, we need them in April. March 31 is the deadline. So why do I emphasize that? Because what happened in March of 2015 went viral. So in order to get into the negotiation at the end of March, the UK and Switzerland and Luxembourg agreed to come in the middle of March. Those were the first non-Asian countries. And why was that noteworthy? Well, until then, there has been a lot of speculation that this was going to be a Chinese bank run by China, located in Beijing, kind of like the World Bank in Washington in the United States. And maybe it wouldn't have the same standards, and the US was opposed to it. And so a lot of the developed countries weren't interested in coming in. But once the UK announced in March that they were going to join, and the US made some negative comments about that got reported in the press, all of a sudden, on March 31st, which was the deadline, all these other countries came in. And there was some emails, I guess there was an email notice that was being sent to the negotiators, and we were actually in negotiations on March 31st in Almaty, Kazakhstan, sitting at a table, and people don't always turn their cell phones off even when they're supposed to. And so at what must have been close of business in Beijing, you suddenly heard this ping, 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 ping all the way around the table as people were getting emails with the list of countries that were coming in. I was not on that list, so I found out later. The lawyer is not always the first to know. So there's a lot that's been written about how suddenly we went from 22 Asian countries signing the MOU in October to 57 countries that spanned most of Europe, not North America until Canada joined later, but South America, where Brazil was in, South Africa. So basically, Japan, the US, Canada were not members, and the US and Japan have not yet joined. So that's just to give you a picture of what does this institution look like, and where did it come from. It really was a negotiation that looked at what all of the other banks had been at and what European perspectives were, what Asian perspectives were, so not just coming out of one mold. So what did we end up with? So AIB's mandate is to provide support for infrastructure and other productive sectors. And let me just say a word about other productive sectors. First, it goes back directly to 1944 and the World Bank Charter and the IMF Charter, which talk about productive purposes or productive resources throughout. And actually, in World Bank legal opinions, productive purposes is really important because you want to make sure that you're not lending for other things that aren't productive. And some of the history says, why is that? Because in the 1930s, there were a lot of loans that weren't paid back, and there were a lot of issues in the pre-war period for things like loans for military, loans for budget, things like that. So other productive sectors finds its way 70 years later into some completely different charter. But it's also quite wonderful as a lawyer, because if you ask the president of AIB, Jin-Li Chun, what other productive sectors means, I'm pretty sure he will say other productive sectors means other productive sectors, which as his former lawyer, I think is great, because somebody's going to have to write a legal opinion sometime saying something was an other productive sector, and at least he won't have mocked it up. What can it provide finance for? Similar to the other MDBs in their different ways, you can provide loans, you can make guarantees of other people's loans, you can invest in equity, and you can do this in the public sector, you can do it in the private sector. So AIB has sovereign loan projects, but they also have non-sovereign projects. The policies, I'll get to in a minute. We also did build in the possibility of new financial instruments. Why? Again, kind of a legal point, because these institutions live under a charter that's like a constitution. And they're usually not very easy to change. So I think that financial wizards can come up with a lot of different structures of transactions that might make sense for developing countries to build infrastructure. And they might not absolutely look like a loan or a guarantee. So if it's some new kind of facility and it makes sense for the institution, we put in a clause that said the Board of Governors, which is the highest organ, can decide on other types of instruments. Just get it approved, make the case, and then do it in a way that's optimal for that kind of instrument. Don't try to squeeze it into looking like a loan. What's the importance of that? The important thing is that that's the kind of thing that the members thought you should be doing. What kind of operational policies apply to these projects that AIB helps finance? Well, there was a lot of concern beforehand that these AIB projects would not have the best international standards. In part, that was fueled because China's domestic overseas finance mechanisms, China Exim Bank and China Development Bank, don't have the best reputations for environmental and social policies. They've certainly made an effort, as far as I've read, to improve them, but there's still a lot of skepticism. So there was this question, is AIB going to follow domestic Chinese practices, or is it going to be like the other multilateral banks? As it happens, starting from the very beginning, AIB's policies, the idea was indeed to take the best practice. People who had similar careers to mine in multilateral development banks in environment and social and procurement and anti-corruption all did the same kind of cross-institution consultation. I won't say that they're better or worse, they're just compatible, because you have to remember that you basically have the same countries sitting at the table negotiating the new World Bank environmental and social policy and the AIB policy. So it is a different location for the same discussion, but it's not something that the institutions themselves, that the staff kind of control. But in the end, AIB's policies are quite fairly open. There is a requirement of transparency, which the others all do. We just put it in the charter because we could update it, so we did. One of the things about having comparable policies is that you can have co-financing, and that means that two of the or more of these institutions can finance the same project, which has a lot of benefits, which I can talk about later. It is very common. So if you had different policies for different parts of the project, it would be both a nightmare for the developing country, but it would also be very hard to do a simple co-financing. Whereas if you have a project prepared that this meets my rules and it meets your rules, then it's much easier to go in and finance the same thing. And some of the reasons for co-financing are infrastructure projects are large. Nobody wants to take all of that risk. AIB is a long way from having a global network of country offices, and you need local staff to supervise and prepare these projects. And I think there's also some learning curve for AIB. Eventually, I think they'll have fewer co-finance projects. So co-financing is kind of normal, but that's a lot of what's gone on. So far, they have approved 31 projects that total up to about $6.3 billion, some sovereign, some non-sovereign. About 70% have been, by number, have been done with other multilateral development banks. India, interestingly enough, has 30% by amount of AIB lending. So that gives you some idea of the global politics. And the members, we started with 57 approved members. 30 new members, that is 30 countries, have applied to join and have been approved to join AIB since it was established, and some of them already have, so there are now 68 members, of which Canada is one. Most of Asia is in, except for Japan, a lot of countries in Latin America, Africa. So that's a lot of the background. The last thing I want to talk about before using up all of my time is AIB's governance, because this is something else that drew a lot of attention. And for some people, governance is a code word for which country is the largest shareholder. But I guess I'm in a position where I tend to take a more technical view. So AIB has the same kind of three-level governance structure that the others do. There's a board of governors, there's a board of directors, and there's the president and the management. The board of governors is one governor for every country, every member. So case of the World Bank, 189. Case of AIB, there'll be 87. ADB, Asian Development Bank, has 67. European Bank for Reconstruction and Development also has 66, 67. Obviously, you can send decisions of a high order of importance to the institution, to the Board of Governors. When I joined the World Bank, I think they were still sending out cables and waiting 6 weeks for a reply. They now have an electronic voting system, so things do get updated eventually. It's still not a good decision discussion mechanism. The actual business really just happens in terms of voting. Most decisions are taken at the board of directors level. So the board of directors are elected by the governors, and each director casts the votes of the governor that voted for him. So if there are 12 directors, so on the AIB board, so you got 87 represented by 12, each one's probably gonna have a group. Sometimes there's one or two. And those are the mechanisms for making decisions. What's gotten a lot of press is the fact that AIB's board is non-resident. If you happen to have a background in company law in many countries, you wouldn't understand why that was a question, since most corporations indeed have non-resident boards of directors, I believe. But in the case of the multilateral development banks, the World Bank was set up with a resident board. That means that the 12 original executive directors, now they're 25, and their 25 alternates, and 3 to 6 advisors for each one of them are resident in Washington, meet Tuesdays and Thursdays to decide on decisions, and meet in committee Monday and Wednesday. It's a pretty heavy mechanism for running an institution. And there's been a debate since the Bretton Woods at the beginning of the bank and the IMF, the World Bank and the IMF, about should it be resident or non-resident. There was John Maynard Keynes, who was the head of the UK delegation, argued in favor of a non-resident board because you would have more senior people in the government who could be represented on the board, rather than having somebody you can spare from your bureaucracy for 2 years or 3 years. And that he didn't see, or they didn't see, the board needing to be involved in day-to-day management. The United States had a different view and prevailed. They wanted to see the board, I think, as a more political control. And since they put a lot of money in, like most of it, I think that they had a reason for that. But this argument between cost and control has been around since then. The European Investment Bank, which is now all the EU members, was established in 1957 with a non-resident board. Now, true, I looked into the history. When EIB was established, there were 6 contiguous European countries. It was not very hard for them to get to the headquarters. But IDB, Asian Development Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, all of them, maybe not IDB, but the other ones, there was always a debate about whether you wanted to have it. So, and if you look at multinationals, you look at the possibility of virtual meetings now, it's really a question about what's the board's role, not are they sitting in the building. Because whatever the board's role is, you certainly know that the management needs supervision and oversight. I have to say, having been a lawyer for management for 30 years, you know that stuff's gonna go wrong, and you know that there needs to be some supervision. So for me, it was never about, oh, let's just not have the board involved. The question is, how can the board meaningfully supervise and get information on what the bank does? And so, in fact, the AIB charter has some explicit provisions about setting up an oversight mechanism under the board of directors that will include things like audit, anti-corruption, accountability, I guess, a project complaints mechanism. But it's much broader than that. You need to have a good code of conduct. You need to have whistleblower protections, because you want in all these different ways to make sure that if anything goes wrong, you're going to hear about it. And preferably to have good policies so things don't go wrong so often. But, things will go wrong. That's part of the world. So let me just finish up by saying the president is appointed by the Board of Governors and basically is in charge of the day-to-day management of the institution. We put in a 2-term limit. Not that many other banks have that one, so a little modern. And there's a mantra that has been in the selection process for the heads of these institutions for a long time of open, transparent, and merit-based process. So we put it in the charter. As it happens, the president of the World Bank has always been a U.S. national. The managing director of the International Monetary Fund has always been a European. The president of the Asian Development Bank has always been Japanese. There are absolutely no legal provisions that require that. And I don't think that saying open, transparent, and merit-based will make any difference unless there's a political will of the members to make a difference. But at least it's a signal that that's what the members thought was important. In terms of decision-making, because it's set up like a company, shareholding determines the voting. How many shares, that's how many votes you get. But when they first designed this, there was a desire to balance that with the notion perhaps of sovereignty, that countries were equal. So shareholding determines not all of the voting power, and then there's a chunk of voting power, it's not that complicated, but I won't try to explain it, that's equal for everybody. And the effect of that is to shave down the importance of shareholding for the big countries and to increase the voting power of the small countries. So for example, China's shareholding in AIB is about 31%. Their voting power is about 26%. Fiji, I think, is 0.01, and shareholding, and their voting power is 0.02. Obviously, it's not very important, but that is how the math works. But it's also interesting because this idea that you should have more of it being equal, of course, benefits countries that, based on their size of shareholding, whether it's Norway and New Zealand and Singapore, who happen to be small but well-off shareholders, or it's poorer countries who have about the same shareholding. We did a few things to try to give some more voice for developing countries and for smaller countries. But the main thing that people focus on is the fact that China has 26% of the vote, and that there are a number of majorities that require 75% of voting power. So there are a number of decisions that China can block. There are a number of decisions in the World Bank and IMF that the United States can block, and that has been really important to the United States. And we can talk about that more if people are interested. What I want to emphasize, though, is that what's in the legal documents is a number. It's not a name. So unlike the UN Charter, where the permanent members of the Security Council are named in the Charter, it is a number. And at one moment, this was brought home to me at one point in the reforms in the World Bank, there was a lot of talk about, well, let's get rid of the US veto. And the same in the IMF. And then a number of the large developing countries said, well, wait a minute. You know, 4 of us can get together and add up to 15. 15's a little easier to get to than 25. And we might want to do that sometime. So let's just leave it where it is. And honestly, I'm sure that I have not added up in a long time what the EU was, but if EU voted as a bloc, they could block things as well. So there's a lot of different ways you can slice and dice the numbers. A word about the future, maybe, before your questions. I think so far AIB has done relatively well in its 3 years. We had the first negotiation in January of 2015 in a small conference room in the Trident Hotel in Mumbai, and there were 26 Asian countries there. Saudi Arabia and New Zealand came, but basically no other developed countries. And AIB could have ended there. There are lots of smaller, sub-regional, multilateral development banks that provide financing and do great things. It didn't for some of the reasons I discussed, but I went to AIB's 3rd annual meeting in Mumbai in the Trident Hotel in June. And it was the 3-ring circus that most of these annual meetings are. They've got $6 billion in their books. They've got a AAA rating for when they go borrowing. So far I think there's a lot of incentives, even if you're the largest shareholder, to play by the kind of multilateral playbook. You want to keep that AAA rating because that's how you get most of your cash, and the cheaper you borrow at, the cheaper you can lend to developing countries at. So there's a built-in incentive in this mechanism to do that. And yet, if one of the sad things for me in researching the book was I looked some more into the history of the other multilateral development banks. I discovered that the United States had objected to and did not want to join the Inter-American Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and the European Bank for some time until they finally came on board. I saw a lot of the sort of rampant geopolitics that goes into the birth of these institutions and thought, I feel really silly because for 30 years I wrote those nice legal memos about how no political interference and no only economic considerations should apply to World Bank decisions. And it does seem a little bit naive to think that these institutions that are born in this sort of, cauldron of geopolitics will suddenly, the moment they're set up, just say, okay, walls up, we're gonna do everything just fine inside. So, will that affect AIB? Maybe. Will the US and Japan come in? I doubt the US will join for some time. It would be really good if the US did, because for two reasons. One, personally, I think the US should be willing to join multilateral institutions they don't control. And they won't have a controlling voice here. And second, it would be great for AIB's privileges and immunities if the United States were a member. Japan, I think, is not interested yet, but I think if this becomes a real Asian institution, it really is in Japan's interest to do that. China's got a lot of room to give if they're willing to go below 25%, and at this point I think they might be, to give some shareholding room to Japan. But you gotta ask, it's a multilateral institution, so maybe the other shareholders such as Australia, Korea, Germany, UK, France, which are some of the larger ones, they will probably be happy to take a haircut to get Japan in. I don't know about India and Russia. I don't know about Indonesia. Maybe yes, maybe no. So it is a global question. It's not. It's so easy to see it as U.S. China or China Japan, but when you sort of try to solve it, everybody's on board. So expect the unexpected.